My 49-year-old Aunt Karen has autism, but due to the time and place she was born, she's never received any kind of mental health assistance. My grandmother, now 84, has always insisted that this was what was best for her. Growing up in a different era, my grandma subscribed to old-fashioned beliefs. Either Karen would be locked away in an institution or hidden upstairs, away from prying eyes, until she died. It's something that's haunted our family for decades. Whenever we've tried to broach the topic, Grandma's response has always been the same. "You don't understand what it was like back then. I've done what's best for her. She's better off at home where people can't judge her." Because of this, Karen has never had the opportunity to learn coping mechanisms or how to manage her emotions. She's been trapped in this bubble her whole life, only leaving the house for rare occasions like doctor visits or funerals. Over the years, her behavior during family gatherings has become a recurring problem, especially around the holidays. This year was no different. Thanksgiving started normally enough, well, as normal as it could be. The kitchen was warm, the smell of turkey and pies filled the air, and the family gathered around the table, laughing and chatting. Karen was excited about her favorite tradition, watching the Charlie Brown Thanksgiving special. She's watched it every year since she was a little girl. It's one of the few things she clings to, her anchor in an otherwise unpredictable world. But this year, something went wrong. The network didn't air the special. We tried explaining that streaming services now have exclusive rights to it, and offered to set it up for her, but it wasn't the same. Karen didn't understand why it wasn't on TV, as it had been for decades. Her agitation started with pacing and muttering, which was fairly common when she got upset. But then the muttering turned into louder, unintelligible cries. Before we knew it, she was on the floor, thrashing her arms and legs, knocking over books and a lamp. "Karen, honey, calm down!" Grandma pleaded, rushing over to her. But Karen couldn't hear her, or wouldn't. In her frustration, she grabbed the nearest thing she could, a bowl of stuffing. She hurled it across the room, aiming for the TV. The bowl missed, crashing into the wall instead, leaving a sticky trail of breadcrumbs and herbs sliding down to the floor. The room went silent for a moment, save for Karen's escalating screams. Then, as quickly as it started, she dropped to all fours and crawled up the stairs to her bedroom, slamming the door behind her. We could still hear her yelling and sobbing from upstairs. She refused to come out until the Charlie Brown special was on, something that wasn't going to happen. The rest of us sat around the dining table in stunned silence. Grandma was visibly shaken but tried to play it off, muttering something about how at least she didn't break the TV. But it was clear this was taking a toll on her. Karen's episodes had become more frequent and intense over the past few years, and Grandma's age and health were making it harder for her to handle them. We decided this was the moment to confront Grandma about the situation. My mom started cautiously. "Mom, you can't keep doing this. Karen needs help. You're too old to manage this on your own anymore." Grandma's lips tightened and she shook her head. "I've taken care of her this long. I can manage. I know what's best for my daughter." "Mom," my uncle chimed in, "we're not saying you've done anything wrong, but things are different now. There are programs, support groups, and even live-in care options. She could still stay close to home, but you'd have help." "I can't let people know I have a daughter like her. What would the neighbors think?" Grandma snapped, her voice rising. "She just needs to stay inside and away from people." We exchanged looks. This was always her defense, her way of shutting down the conversation. But this time, we didn't let it slide. "Mom," my aunt said gently, "this isn't the 1950s anymore. No one is going to judge you for getting her the help she needs. If anything, people will admire you for doing it." Grandma sighed, her resolve wavering for just a moment before she dug in again. "You're all making a big fuss over nothing. If it's the stuffing you're upset about, I made 2 bowls." She gave a tight smile, completely ignoring the bigger issue. "Mom, it's not about the stuffing," my mom said, her voice tinged with frustration. "It's about you. You're 84 years old. What happens to Karen if something happens to you? What happens then?" That question hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. For once, Grandma didn't have a quick retort. She looked down at her lap, fidgeting with the edge of her napkin. Upstairs, Karen's sobbing had quieted, leaving the house eerily silent. The unspoken truth was clear. Grandma couldn't keep this up forever, but convincing her to change, to let go of the guilt and fear she'd carried for so long, was going to take time. We didn't resolve anything that night, but the conversation was a start. And as we picked at the remains of our Thanksgiving dinner, I couldn't help but wonder if we'd ever truly be able to give Karen the life she deserved, or if Grandma's stubbornness would keep them both trapped in the past. Last year, I invited 3 of my closest friends from class over for Thanksgiving. My roommates and I had planned a cozy celebration in our small apartment. The plan was simple: cook together, eat too much, and spend the evening laughing over silly board games. Things started off great. We had everything prepped. The turkey was seasoned, sides were ready to go, and dessert was waiting in the fridge. But right as we were about to put the turkey in the oven, disaster struck. Our ancient oven, which had been making weird noises for weeks, finally gave up. The pilot light refused to ignite no matter what we tried. We stood there in the kitchen, surrounded by half-cooked dishes, trying to figure out what to do. That's when I remembered my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who lived a floor below us. She had a functioning oven, and we had a key to her place because she was away visiting her daughter for the holidays. She had asked me to water her plants and keep an eye on her apartment while she was gone. It felt odd using someone else's kitchen, but we didn't have many options. So we gathered our trays and pans and headed downstairs to her apartment. Mrs. Henderson's place had always felt a bit old-fashioned, with its floral wallpaper, doilies on every surface, and the faint scent of lavender and mothballs. We quickly got to work putting the turkey in her oven and arranging the sides on her counter. It wasn't ideal, but we were making it work. While we waited for the turkey to cook, my friends began to explore her apartment. At first, it was harmless curiosity, admiring her collection of porcelain figurines, flipping through the old photo albums on the coffee table and marveling at how neat everything was. Mrs. Henderson was a bit of a perfectionist, and her home reflected that. But then one of my friends, Lisa, decided to venture further. "I wonder what the rest of her place looks like," she said, half joking, as she wandered toward the hallway leading to the bedrooms and bathroom. I was about to call her back when I heard her scream. The rest of us rushed down the hall, our footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. Lisa stood frozen in the bathroom doorway, her face pale as a sheet. At first, I thought she'd seen a spider or something silly, but when I followed her gaze, my stomach dropped. Mrs. Henderson was there, lying on the bathroom floor. She was motionless, her body twisted unnaturally, and her skin had a grayish hue. For a moment, no one moved. The cheerful hum of the kitchen timer in the background felt surreal, almost mocking. "Is she dead?" Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't know what to do. None of us did. My roommate Daniel finally broke the spell and pulled out his phone to call 911. As he spoke to the operator, I knelt beside Mrs. Henderson. She was cold to the touch, and I knew deep down that she was gone, but I couldn't stop myself from checking for a pulse. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but it felt like hours. We stayed in the living room, huddled together and too shocked to speak as they carried her out. The police asked us a few questions, but it was clear from the start that there was no foul play. She'd likely passed away from natural causes. Thanksgiving was a blur after that. We packed up our half-cooked meal and went back upstairs, but no one felt like eating anymore. The turkey stayed in the fridge, untouched, for days. Mrs. Henderson's daughter came by the next day to thank us for calling the authorities. She said her mom had a history of heart problems, and this wasn't entirely unexpected. Still, it didn't make it any less heartbreaking. That Thanksgiving, I learned how fragile life is and how quickly everything can change. What started as a day of laughter and togetherness ended with a stark reminder of our mortality. Every time I walk past Mrs. Henderson's old apartment, I think of her in that quiet, eerie moment in her bathroom. When I was 15, my family visited my grandparents' small farm nestled in a hollow for Thanksgiving. as we did every year. The farm wasn't a commercial operation, just a place they used to sustain themselves. Over the years, as my grandparents got older, they stopped maintaining the barn. It became a storage area, forgotten and dusty. Thanksgiving was a family affair, with all the usual chatter and laughter filling the house. But at that age, I had started to drift away from the adult stories about the good old days. After we finished an early dinner around 2 p.m., I felt restless and told my parents I was heading out to explore the hollow. It had been a while since I ventured out there, and I didn't feel like dragging my younger siblings along. I wanted some peace and quiet. I wandered through the woods, letting the crisp autumn air clear my mind. The forest had a way of pulling you in, and time seemed to slip away. Before I realized it, the sun had set, and darkness wrapped itself around the hollow. The trek back to the farmhouse was slower than I anticipated, with shadows stretching long and ominous. When I finally returned, the barn caught my eye. In the moonlight, its silhouette looked eerie, almost like something out of a horror movie. I'd always thought it was a little creepy, but seeing it at night made it feel alive in a way I hadn't noticed before. Being a teenage boy with a love for scary things, I felt a thrill of curiosity. If it looked that spooky on the outside, I thought it must be even creepier inside. The barn hadn't been locked in years. My grandparents lived in a safe area, and they barely thought to lock their house, let alone the barn. The heavy wooden latch holding the door shut came loose with a groan, and when I pulled the door open, it let out a loud, spine-chilling creak. It sounded like the door was protesting after being undisturbed for so long. Inside, it was pitch black. I was thankful for the flashlight on my phone, which I turned on immediately. The weak beam of light only heightened the creep factor. The barn was full of old tools, many sharp and rusted, hanging on the walls like forgotten relics of the past. A small hatchet on a workbench caught my attention. It was discolored, and as I looked closer, I realized the blade was coated in something dark and dry. I figured it was old animal blood from the days when my grandparents slaughtered chickens and pigs. Still, it sent a shiver down my spine. I noticed the ladder leading up to the loft and decided to climb it. The loft was full of hay, and the smell of age and dust hung heavy in the air. As I swept the light around, it caught something shiny buried in the hay. Curious, I approached and began moving the hay aside. What I uncovered made my blood run cold. A skull, its empty eye socket staring directly at me, peeked out from the hay. I screamed and stumbled backward, almost falling off the loft. My heart raced as I scrambled down the ladder and bolted out of the barn, leaving the door wide open behind me. When I burst into the house, breathless and pale, my parents and grandparents gathered around me. Between gasps, I told them what I'd found. My dad, a towering man with the strength and confidence of someone unafraid of much, grabbed a flashlight and headed to the barn. I stayed behind, shaking, as my grandparents called the sheriff. It turned out the body had been in the loft for several years. The coroner later said the person had been killed with a hatchet, the same one I'd picked up on the workbench. Knowing I had unknowingly held the murder weapon sent chills through me. But even more disturbing was the realization that my grandparents had been living on the farm all that time, unaware that a body had been decomposing in their barn. The police launched an investigation, but no leads ever turned up. To this day, no one knows who the victim was, who killed them, or why. The barn has since been torn down, but every Thanksgiving, I can't help but think about that night and the grim discovery that changed our family forever.